In the tranquil farmlands of Sunnyside, Texas, 8-year-old Grace Mitchell was about to upend the violent ambitions of a ruthless cartel. When Los Cuervos demolished her family's simple vegetable stand and threatened her mother, they thought they were dealing with an ordinary household. What they didn't know was that Grace's father was a legendary Navy SEAL, a man whose operations overseas were shrouded in classified secrecy. By targeting this unassuming farm, the cartel would inadvertently expose one of the most dangerous criminal networks in the Southwest and spark a battle that would forever change a small Texas town. Each morning, Grace stood proudly at her modest roadside stand, the early light catching the dew on her fresh produce. The Mitchell land, handed down through generations, had always been a place of hard work and cherished family moments. But when strange vehicles began appearing on the dusty roads, the peaceful rhythm of Sunnyside shifted toward danger. The day her father returned marked the turning point. Once just another quiet farming community, Sunnyside soon witnessed an unforgettable showdown, one that proved a determined family, backed by the skill of an elite SEAL, could stand firm against the darkest threats that lurked just beyond the fields. Quick pause before we continue. Welcome to Fabled Frames. Please tell us where you are watching from. Don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow's story is mind-blowing. 8-year-old Grace Mitchell slid the last pint of strawberries onto the display of her small farm stand, the slatted wooden boards creaking as she moved about. The late afternoon sun bathed Sunnyside, Texas, in a warm glow reflecting off the scattering of vehicles that rolled by on the dusty rural road. With a practiced motion, Grace positioned a hand-lettered sign advertising strawberries, $2, exactly as her mother had shown her. The stand was a simple structure, for posts, a slanted roof covered in sheet metal, and a small table for the produce. Yet, to Grace, it was everything. It was her mission, her enterprise, and a place she could help provide for her family even at such a young age. Since her father had departed on his special project overseas, Grace had never felt more determined. Helping her mother, Angela Mitchell, maintain the modest farmland took on a new importance. Though Grace was only 8, her brown eyes shone with conviction each morning as she rose to feed the chickens, gather eggs, and water the vegetables. Angela insisted on schooling, chores, and bedtimes, but the farm stand was Grace's pride. Children from across the county frequented the roadsides in the summer, peddling lemonade or tomatoes from small tables, but Grace's stand had become a local staple. She had a knack for conversation and earnest honesty and, as most of the neighbors said, a Mitchell spirit. People sensed there was something special about her. Perhaps it was the glimmer of her father's grit in her determined eyes. Her father, John Mitchell, was, according to rumor, half the reason they'd moved to this quiet patch of Texas farmland. He was a teacher of agricultural techniques, or so the official story went, but the small-town rumor mill churned with far more interesting theories. Some said he was involved with government work, that he had a background in something specialized. Others claimed he was a traveling adventurer who simply visited other countries to learn about new farming methods. The Mitchells themselves offered few details. When Grace asked, Angela would say, "Your father helps people in need, farmers, yes, but sometimes more than just farmers." And that was enough for an 8-year-old. In the evenings, Grace and her mother would watch the sinking sun, talk about how the day's crops fared, and sometimes imagine what new places John might be visiting. Their sprawling fields, dotted with rows of corn and a tidy orchard of peach trees, brought in enough of a living to support them. Angela also worked part-time at a small legal office in town, but the real heart of their livelihood was this land. Owning a piece of Texas soil, being able to plant seeds and harvest them was more than just a job for the Mitchells. It was a family legacy anchored by the memory of John's ancestors who had toiled in fields for generations. Sunnyside was tiny enough that nearly everyone knew everyone else's name and story. The main street had a single traffic light, a post office, and a diner that served as the community's de facto meeting place. On the outskirts, dusty roads stretched into farmland. It was at one bend in such a road where Grace's stand beckoned, the signage bright against the subdued colors of the surrounding farmland. Locals in pickups, families in sedans, and even the occasional tourist would stop by for fresh produce and to see the bright-eyed girl who was so fiercely proud of her gleanings. This particular afternoon, Grace noticed an unfamiliar set of vehicles rumbling past. They were black SUVs, shiny, tinted windows, not the usual dusty trucks from local ranchers. She felt a chill run through her, but she brushed it off. Strange cars passed now and then, sometimes travelers, sometimes business folk. However, something in the way they drove slowly by and lingered their gaze on the farmland left her unsettled. She glanced toward the porch of the farmhouse where her mother stood behind the screen door. Angela had a perpetual sense of caution these days, especially with John overseas. She waved at Grace and signaled her to come in for dinner, but the 8-year-old waved back, indicating she needed a moment to close up the stand. "Be careful out there," Angela called softly. Grace quickly covered the fresh strawberries and vegetables, wanting to ensure everything stayed crisp for the next morning. As she did, a second SUV, identical to the first, cruised by, slowing to a near crawl, then sped off in a roar of gravel. Grace felt her heart flutter with an unease she couldn't place. But being 8, she tried to distract herself with a childish tune as she finished tidying up. That night, as Grace helped her mother with dishes after dinner, she asked, "Mom, who do you think those men in the SUVs were?" Angela's brow furrowed. "I'm not sure, sweetheart. Some real estate folks? Investors? Could be people just passing through." Grace shrugged, though the memory lingered in her mind. She finished her chores, brushed her teeth, and went to bed with the lingering thought that something was shifting in Sunnyside, something that didn't feel quite right. But children are resilient. She soon drifted off to sleep, unaware of how dramatically her world was about to change. The next day began uneventfully. Grace awoke with the sunrise, the golden light streaming through her modest bedroom curtains. She hopped from bed with her customary energy, quickly dressing in worn jeans and a t-shirt featuring a cartoon rabbit, hardly the attire of a typical produce vendor, but it was what made her comfortable. She hurried to the kitchen where Angela was frying eggs. The aroma of coffee and bacon filled the air. Their small kitchen was decorated in cheerful whites and yellows with crocheted doilies and potted herbs on the windowsill. It still bore the personal touches John had insisted upon before he left. He liked a home that felt warm, and Angela maintained it meticulously in his absence. Just as Grace finished her breakfast, she spotted movement at the end of the driveway through the kitchen window. A black SUV. The same kind of vehicle as the night before. Her heart fluttered as the vehicle sat idle near the property line. "Mom," Grace's voice quivered. Angela looked up, her expression shifting. She walked toward the window, coffee mug in hand. "Stay here," she said, her tone quiet but urgent. She left the house through the side door, crossing the yard to the fence separating the farmland from the road. Grace watched from the window, her small hands clenched on the countertop. She couldn't hear the conversation outside, but she saw Angela speak to someone inside the SUV, then gesture firmly. The SUV's window was down, a man's elbow visible on the rim. After a minute or two, Angela turned sharply and walked away, her face pale but determined. The SUV rumbled off, kicking up a swirl of dust as it disappeared down the county road. When Angela came back inside, her hand trembled as she tried to set her coffee mug on the kitchen table. She missed by a fraction, and a few drops of coffee splashed onto the wood. "Mom, are you okay?" Grace asked, rushing over. "Who was that?" Angela pressed a hand to her forehead and inhaled slowly. "Just some men asking about property," she said, though there was a tightness in her voice that made Grace uneasy. "Listen, don't worry. They were just looking for farmland to buy. Probably nothing." But Grace was no fool. She may have been 8, but she read her mother's body language like a well-loved book. There was fear in Angela's eyes, pure and unguarded. Minutes later, the phone rang. Angela answered, her tone instantly shifting. "Oh, hi, Sheriff." Yes, they just left." "No, I told them we're not selling." They got insistent. A pause. "All right. Thank you for checking in." She hung up and forced a smile for her daughter. "It'll be okay, Grace. Let's just go about our day." And so they did. Grace spent the morning cleaning the barn and refilling water troughs for the goats. She hummed to herself to dispel worry. The bright Texas sun was so familiar and comforting it made it difficult to believe anything truly bad could happen here. Still, that unease lingered. There was a sense of new eyes watching the Mitchell farm. When Grace went to open her produce stand that afternoon, she thought she saw an SUV parked far down the road by the orchard, partially concealed by tall grass. But every time she tried to look directly, it seemed to vanish, leaving behind only the heat waves shimmering above the asphalt. Something was coming. The innocence of Sunnyside hung in the balance, and though Grace couldn't articulate it, she felt it deeply in her gut. If only her father were there. She'd never felt safer than when he'd hold her on his knee and tell her stories about traveling to different parts of the world. He didn't mention danger or conflict. He spoke of people he helped, farmland he saw, how seeds could flourish in any soil if properly cared for. Grace adored those stories, but now she felt an urgent desire for him to be home, to stand between them and these ominous strangers. Evening arrived with more tension. Angela closed up the house earlier than usual, double-checking locks and windows. Normally, they left the porch lights on for neighbors or the occasional stray cat. That night, Angela left every exterior light blazing, turning the farmhouse into a beacon in the darkness. Grace couldn't sleep. She tossed in bed, the hush of the fields doing little to calm her. Eventually, she drifted off, only to be jolted awake by a low rumbling. Voices. Shouts. The clang of metal. She shot upright, adrenaline raging through her veins. She heard her mother's door open, footsteps rushing down the hallway. Bang! The sound echoed outside. Grace leapt from bed and dashed to the window. Her father's tall silhouette was nowhere in sight. Her mind automatically searched for it, some part of her forgetting momentarily that he was overseas. Outside, near the produce stand, headlights illuminated a group of figures. She counted 4. They hefted crowbars and baseball bats. With an almost casual brutality, they swung at the wooden structure, smashing it apart. The produce crates spilled open, strawberries rolling into the dirt, tomatoes bursting under the stomping of boots. Her prized vegetables, the stand she built with so much love, was being annihilated before her eyes. For a moment, Grace stood paralyzed. She watched in disbelief as one of the men lifted a red gas can and doused the remnants of the stand. Another struck a match, letting it fall. A whoosh of flame erupted, devouring the planks in a hungry blaze. The flickering orange glow revealed their faces, hardened, uncaring expressions, wearing black jackets, gloved hands. Angela rushed up behind Grace, pulling her away from the window. "Don't look, baby," she whispered fiercely. "But why?" "Because they can," Angela said grimly. The front door pounded, rattling in its frame. "Open up," a voice demanded, thick with a Spanish accent. "We need to talk, Senora." Angela grabbed her phone. She glanced at Grace, eyes wild. "Get in the closet, go." Terrified, Grace obeyed, crawling into a small hallway closet as Angela locked it from the outside. She peered through the slats in the door, her heart pounding. She could just see the living room as Angela clenched the phone and pressed a few buttons. Grace heard a faint ring, likely to the sheriff. Then the front door burst inward with a splintering crack. 3 men flooded into the living room. Angela stumbled back, letting out a short gasp. The largest man had a short-cropped mustache and wore a black jacket with a red raven emblem on the sleeve, a Los Cuervos, though Grace was too young to recognize the cartel name. Another man, taller, with tattoos coiling around his neck, stepped forward, brandishing a pistol. "You do not call the police," he snapped, snatching the phone from Angela's grasp and hurling it into a nearby wall. The device shattered. He then seized Angela by the collar of her nightgown, forcing her to stand on her toes. Grace pressed her hands to her mouth to stifle a scream. The floor beneath her seemed to heave with dread. She felt so helpless, so small. Where was her father? She willed him to appear, to come crashing through the wall and save them. But the living room remained a scene of terror, illuminated by the overhead light and the dancing glow of the fire outside. The tattooed man leaned in. His breath smelled of cigarettes. "You own this land?" Angela tried to collect herself, voice shaking. "Yes." "Let me go." He sneered. "You will sell. You will sign it over tomorrow." "See?" She shook her head. I can't. This is our home." The man slapped her, the blow echoing. Angela staggered but refused to collapse. A line of red appeared on her lip. The other men began rummaging through the house, opening drawers, appending cushions. Grace felt tears burn her eyes as she watched them tear apart her family's possessions. The tall man yanked open a hallway closet near the kitchen, rummaging for who knew what. Grace felt a moment of raw terror that he'd checked the closet she was in. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting. Outside, the flames that had consumed the produce stand died down to embers, drifting sparks into the night sky. The largest man stepped forward, pressing a piece of paper into Angela's hand. "This is the number. You call tomorrow. We arranged the sale. You do not want us to come back." Angela's voice trembled. "I'll fine, just let me talk to my husband." One of the men let out a mirthless laugh. "Good luck. We know he's gone." He gestured with the pistol. "You do this, or next time there'll be more than a stand on fire." With that, he shoved Angela into the couch. Her head snapped back, striking the frame with a dull thud. Grace's pulse thundered as the men turned and exited the house. Through the closet slats, she watched their shadows flit across the walls in a menacing dance. Finally, the roar of SUV engines drifted away. And then silence. She waited, shaking, until she heard Angela's soft sobs. Inch by inch, Grace emerged from the closet. She ran to her mother, wrapping her small arms around her. Angela tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. The acrid scent of smoke wafted in from outside, a haunting reminder of the destruction visited upon them. "Mom," Grace whispered, Are we going to be okay?" Angela held her daughter tightly, her expression darkening. "We have to call the sheriff. And we have to get your father home." Grace didn't fully understand, but in her child's heart, she believed one thing absolutely. If her father could see what these men had done, they would regret ever stepping foot on the Mitchell farm. 2 days later, half a world away, John Mitchell was crouched beside a battered pickup truck in a remote village. The air was thick with dust and the scent of diesel. Locals shuffled around the small farming cooperative he was helping to set up, and occasionally he offered pointers in fluent Spanish. He'd spent the last months training groups of farmers in new irrigation techniques. The official story was that John worked as an agricultural consultant for an international aid organization. But he wore a watch that no mere consultant would own, a tactical watch with built-in navigation and communication features. And beneath his rolled sleeves, faint scars told of a life in the shadows, a tale of covert operations and dangerous missions. Years ago, John had served as one of the Navy SEALs' top operators. His skill set was lethal, but he'd found a purpose in using those abilities to stabilize vulnerable communities and fight for the underdog. The cover of Agricultural Advisor allowed him to move relatively unnoticed in places where paramilitary or extremist groups threatened local populations. He taught farmland defense as much as he taught soil health, ensuring communities could survive on their own land without being overrun. He was in the middle of showing a middle-aged farmer how to assemble a more efficient drip irrigation system when his watch vibrated. A priority message from stateside, an unusual occurrence. As soon as he checked it, his face turned to stone. It was from the local sheriff in Sunnyside, who had a secure contact method with John in case of emergencies. The message was short, but it made John's blood run cold. Mitchell Farm attacked. Angela and Grace threatened. Cartel involvement suspected. Need immediate contact. An invisible fist clenched around his heart. John rose, ignoring the startled farmer who tried to ask a question. His mind raced, calculating the fastest route back to Texas. He had a secondary passport and credit cards for emergency travel, standard procedure in his line of work. Within minutes, he was in motion, handing off responsibilities to a trusted colleague and grabbing a dusty rucksack from a storage hut. He didn't have all the details, but he knew enough. Los Cuervos. He had crossed paths with them once in Central America, ruthless, heavily armed, and well-funded by narcotics trafficking. They specialized in intimidation, extortion, and brutal violence. That they had shown up at his doorstep in Sunnyside, threatening his wife and daughter, was unthinkable. John felt a simmering fury crackle beneath his calm exterior. He forced himself to breathe steadily. He'd been trained to keep his emotions in check, to use anger as a tool rather than be used by it. Focus, he told himself. This is a mission. Get back. Secure the farm. Neutralize the threat. Protect your family. By the time the sun set over that distant land, John was already en route to the nearest city, carrying only essentials, a small duffel, a concealed sidearm with minimal ammunition, and a phone loaded with encrypted contacts. He had allies scattered across the globe. Some owed him favors, others simply respected a man who had bled side by side with them in places the media never covered. 1 or 2 calls, and he might have a private transport that could save him days. He was used to clandestine travel. He'd slip out of one airport, appear in another, and be back in the United States before any official logs could catch up. It was a skill he'd perfected in the SEAL teams. As the small plane finally taxied down a makeshift runway at dawn, John sent a single-line message to the sheriff. "On my way. Keep them safe." He allowed himself a brief moment to imagine Grace's smiling face. She would be terrified. He clenched a fist. No matter what, they would never harm her again. Every ounce of training he'd ever received told him the same thing. In war, you eliminate the threat completely, or it will come back stronger. There would be no half measures when it came to protecting his family. Back in Sunnyside, Sheriff Ralph Hastings sat in his cramped office on Main Street. He stared at the phone, waiting for any incoming calls from John. The desk in front of him was littered with files, maps, and scribbled notes about the uptick in suspicious activity around town. Over the past months, Hastings had received scattered reports of black SUVs, men asking about land, small-time intimidation near the county line. He'd alerted state law enforcement, but resources were stretched thin and official responses were slow. Sunnyside had never been a major hub for narcotics or trafficking, but the landscape offered something the cartels valued: open stretches of farmland that could hide nearly anything from drug caches to makeshift airstrips. With the right intimidation, ranchers or farmers could be coerced into cooperation. The Mitchell farm, conveniently located with roads leading to multiple Texas highways, was a prime target. Hastings had known John for years, although he only had bits and pieces of the man's background. He knew John had served in some elite military capacity. A part of Hastings suspected that if John Mitchell was truly roused to anger, that anger would be lethal. Hastings was both relieved and uneasy at that thought. He wanted the cartel gone, but he knew the potential for violence was sky-high. Angela was safe for the moment. He'd convinced her to move into a friend's guest cottage closer to the center of town, at least until John returned. Grace stayed close by, reluctant to leave her mother's side. The child had nightmares every night since the attack. Yet she refused to show fear in the daytime. Whenever Hastings saw her, she lifted her chin, that determined Mitchell spirit shining through, even if her eyes were ringed with fatigue. A deputy poked his head into the office. "Sheriff, got a call from down near Salt Creek. Somebody saw an SUV with tinted windows parked near the old Granville place. Locals said it's not the usual owner." Hastings sighed, rubbing his temples. "Thanks, Turner. I'll check it out." He stood, grabbing his keys. "Keep an eye out for suspicious traffic on the main roads. And if you hear from Mitchell, let me know immediately." He stepped outside into the bright morning sunshine. Across the street, a few passers-by waved, but the mood in Sunnyside had changed drastically. People whispered about the break-ins, the intimidation, the destruction of the Mitchell-produced stand. The battered remains had become a symbol of fear. Everyone knew that if it could happen to the Mitchells, one of the most well-liked families in town, it could happen to them. Hastings climbed into his patrol SUV and headed towards Salt Creek, scanning the road ahead. He had a pit in his stomach, an instinct that told him the next steps would be pivotal. If the cartel continued to escalate, there would be bloodshed. He prayed John would arrive soon, not entirely sure if that would solve the problem or make it worse. Yet something deep inside told him that the only thing scarier than a cartel was John Mitchell returning home to find his family threatened. At the Mitchell farm, the charred remains of Grace's produce stand sat as a silent testament to the violence. A day earlier, Angela had driven out briefly to salvage anything she could, but there was little left. She felt it was important to show Grace the remains, to remind her that this was real and that they had to be cautious. Grace had stood there, staring at the blackened boards. Ash coated the ground. A twisted piece of metal that used to be her cash box lay near the base. She wanted to cry, but her tears had dried up after the first night. Instead, she bent down and picked through the debris, finding a small sign that had partially survived the flames. The word "fresh" was still visible in peeling paint. Angela placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We'll rebuild," she said softly, tears filling her eyes. "When your dad's home, we'll rebuild bigger and better." Grace nodded, swallowing hard. She didn't say a word, just clutched that half-burned sign against her chest. Her young heart was forging a new resilience in the face of fear. That same afternoon, as Angela and Grace prepared to leave, they heard the rumble of an engine from behind the barn. Anxiety spiked in Angela's chest. She quickly ushered Grace into the pickup truck and started the engine, ready to peel out if necessary. But before she could drive off, a figure stepped into view. He was tall, with broad shoulders, wearing dusty jeans and a plain t-shirt. His hair was cropped short, and there was a certain alertness in his gaze. Immediately, Angela's breath caught. John Mitchell had come home. He stood there, scanning the property with the controlled calm of a soldier surveying a battlefield. When his eyes settled on the charred rubble of the produce stand, Angela saw his jaw clench. And when Grace leapt out of the truck, sprinting across the yard to him, John dropped to one knee and caught her in a fierce embrace. "Daddy!" Grace sobbed, at last letting her tears flow. "I'm here," he whispered, holding her as if he would never let go. "I'm here now." Angela ran to them, tears streaming as she joined the hug, the three of them clinging to each other in the dust and the fading sunlight. For a moment, the world stood still. No matter what threats lurked, John Mitchell was back, and that changed everything. Inside the farmhouse, John listened grimly as Angela recounted the attack in detail. Grace sat nearby, hugging her half-burned, fresh sign, the occasional tear slipping down her cheek. John's eyes flashed with anger, though his face remained composed. When Angela finished, he nodded slowly. "We're not running," he said, voice low and controlled. Angela sighed. "I knew you'd say that. The sheriff offered us witness protection if it comes to that, but we love this land, John. I don't want Grace growing up and hiding." John set his hand over Angela's. "We won't be the ones hiding." He rose and walked through the house, assessing the damage. The front door had been hastily repaired, but it still bore splintered sections. In the living room, drawers and cabinets had been rummaged through, some belongings strewn about. He asked a few questions about the men. Did they wear any insignia, speak Spanish, mention any names? Angela relayed everything. At the mention of the red raven emblem, John closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. "Los Cuervos," he muttered. "I've had run-ins with them before. They're trying to expand into new territories. They want our property as a corridor." Grace piped up, her voice trembling. "Why our farm?" John knelt, looking into his daughter's eyes. "Because we're in a strategic spot. But they made a mistake. They chose the wrong family." He placed his hands on Grace's shoulders. "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. These men are just evil. But they're not invincible." Grace nodded, swallowing hard. In that moment, her father's unwavering confidence seemed to lift some of her fear. She didn't fully grasp what he was capable of, but she felt safe again. John stood, turning to Angela. "I have to call in a favor," he said. "But first, let's meet with the sheriff." Later that day, at the sheriff's office, Sheriff Hastings welcomed John with a firm handshake. The relief in the lawman's face was obvious. "I'm sorry, John," he said. "I tried to keep an eye on your place, but these guys are slippery." John nodded. "I appreciate you looking out for my family. I owe you one." His tone was that of a man who meant every word. Hastings led him to a small briefing room where a county map was tacked onto a corkboard. He pointed to several spots circled in red. "We've had half a dozen sightings of these SUVs. Could be the same group, maybe a few different cells. We don't have the manpower to patrol everywhere, and the state troopers are jammed up with bigger city issues." "Los Cuervos," John confirmed. "I've seen them in Guatemala, Honduras. They muscle in, force landowners to cooperate with them. If the owners resist, they disappear." Hastings nodded grimly. "I'm afraid that's exactly what they plan here. We don't want Sunnyside turning into a pipeline for their smuggling." He sighed heavily. "But I'm at a loss. My deputies are good men, but we're outgunned. The feds, well, they say they're investigating, but it's slow." John's eyes hardened. "We don't have time to wait. They threaten my wife and daughter. I'm putting a stop to this." The sheriff studied John's face, recognizing the deadly calm in his expression. Officially, Hastings said, "I can't condone vigilantism." "Understood," John replied, "but I'll do what I have to do. If you want to keep Sunnyside in one piece, you'll let me help. Off the books, if you prefer." A beat passed. Then Hastings sighed. "Just be careful, John. If you stir the hornet's nest, there'll be consequences." John simply gave a curt nod. Consequences for them more than for us. That evening, John took Angela and Grace to a friend's house in town. They'd stay there under the sheriff's watch while John began his preparations. What those preparations entailed, Angela chose not to pry too closely. She knew John had a background that defied simple explanations. Once they were safely installed, John left, driving an old truck he kept locked in the barn for emergencies. Inside the glove compartment, he found a set of false IDs and travel documents, evidence of a life lived on dangerous edges. He didn't plan to leave. These were simply backups if things escalated too far. He made calls to two trusted contacts from his Navy days, Ray Mendez and Leon Wagner, both retired SEALs with a penchant for private security jobs. He didn't need an army, just a pair of men he trusted with his life. They agreed to meet in Sunnyside as soon as possible. Next, John drove to an out-of-the-way storage facility on the outskirts of a neighboring county. A nondescript metal building with a padlocked door greeted him. He unlocked it and stepped into near darkness, using a small flashlight to find his way. Within lay several large crates marked with cryptic codes. Over the years, John had accumulated weapons and gear, much of it legally acquired, some of it not so clearly accounted for. He was no gun nut, but he believed in being prepared. He opened one crate, revealing a disassembled AR-15, customized with attachments for optics and sound suppression. He checked the parts meticulously, his mind drifting to memories of nights in hostile territory, his rifle the only thing standing between him and death. With grim resolve, he began assembling his arsenal. Firearms, ammunition, tactical gear, enough to handle a small war if it came to that. Outside, the wind picked up. Thunder rumbled in the distance, signifying an approaching storm. The flickering fluorescent light inside the storage unit cast dancing shadows on the concrete floor. John felt an odd sense of calm, the same pre-mission focus he used to feel in the teams. He thought of Grace's produce stand, burnt to cinders, and of Angela's bruised face. His jaw tightened. This was personal. He whispered into the darkness as if speaking directly to the men who had terrorized his family. "You wanted this fight. Now you've got it." The next morning, the weather reflected John's mood: overcast skies, heavy humidity, and the threat of rain. He slipped onto the farm at dawn, scanning the perimeter with a pair of binoculars. No sign of cartel watchers at the moment. He wanted them to come to try something so he could test his new defenses. As part of his plan, he'd rigged a few surprises. Simple, non-lethal traps along the main approaches to the property, tripwires that would trigger noisemakers or flash devices, scaring off intruders and alerting him to their presence. He also positioned a few hidden cameras around the yard, feeding into a small monitor inside the barn. If the cartel tried another attack, they wouldn't get the jump on him. After setting up, he returned to the house, scanning each room for vantage points and choke points. The memories of the last break-in clashed with years of warm family moments. He realized with a pang how close they'd come to losing everything. His phone buzzed. One of his old teammates had arrived in Sunnyside. Ray Mendez stepped out of a rental car, wearing jeans, boots, and a ball cap pulled low over his lean face. The two men clasped hands, a brief grin passing between them. "Been a while, brother," Ray said, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who'd seen too many dusty roads. "Heard you've got a pest problem?" John nodded grimly. "Cartel. They're threatening my family." Ray's expression darkened. "Not on my watch. Where do we start?" A second vehicle pulled up soon after, depositing Leon Wagner, a massive man whose arms bulged with muscle. He too wore civilian clothes, but the way he carried himself screamed military. They greeted each other with quick hugs, displays of camaraderie forged in the fires of war. They spent the next hour going over the property, analyzing possible lines of approach, vantage points for overwatch, and fallback positions. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning clouds, but the tension remained thick as ever. Ray, scanning the horizon with a spotting scope, clicked his tongue. If they come, it'll be after dark or near it. Leon nodded. Wouldn't mind if they showed up sooner. Make it easier. John took a long breath. They will come eventually. If not tonight, soon. They've made it clear they want to force us off this land. He paused, clenching a fist. We show them they picked the wrong place. At midday, the sheriff arrived, his vehicle raising a swirl of dust along the driveway. He stepped out, taking in the sight of John's two heavily muscled friends. A look of mingled relief and wariness crossed his face. You're arming up, Hastings observed. John nodded. I have to. The sheriff rubbed his jaw. I spoke to some folks in the next county. Rumor is these Los Cuervos men are setting up a staging area at an abandoned ranch about 15 miles west. I can't confirm it, but if it's true, they could be planning a larger push. Ray exchanged a knowing glance with Leon. They'd done countless missions and infiltration was a standard approach. John read their expressions. We need intel, he said. Can you get us close, Sheriff? Hastings hesitated. Not officially, but I can pretend to check out a disturbance or something. You could come along as observers. Ray cracked a grin. Observing with rifles in hand, sure. Leon merely nodded in agreement. John tightened the straps on a tactical vest he'd retrieved from storage. All right, we move out in an hour. Let's see what they're planning. As dusk fell, Sheriff Hastings drove west, keeping his headlights off and relying on the glow of the setting sun. John, Ray, and Leon followed in a separate pickup at a distance, each armed with sidearms and rifles discreetly stowed. Despite the informal setup, it felt like a true operation, radio comms, hushed voices, hearts pounding with adrenaline. They reached the old ranch, a sprawling property with broken fences and a dilapidated main house. Sheriff Hastings parked on the far side of a cluster of mesquite trees. Through binoculars, John spotted two black SUVs near the house, their silhouettes visible against the faint twilight. A single guard walked around the perimeter, armed with what looked like a rifle. Light glowed from within the house, flickering as if someone were moving around inside. John's mind raced with possibilities. They might be storing drugs, weapons, or simply using it as a place to plan. Either way, they were too close to Sunnyside. Hastings stayed in his SUV, ready to call for backup if everything went sideways. John, Ray, and Leon slipped out into the tall grass, moving quietly under the canopy of the night sky. They wore dark clothing, hats, and gloves, anything to reduce visibility. Each carried a suppressed pistol, though they hoped not to fire a shot unless necessary. They waited for the lone guard to vanish around the side of the house before creeping closer. Leon, ever the silent giant, took point, scanning for tripwires or alarms. None were visible, a sign the cartel might be relying on intimidation more than advanced security. They reached the back of the house, pressing themselves against the weathered clapboard siding. Through a cracked window, Ray glimpsed three men gathered in what used to be a living room. One was on a phone, speaking Spanish in a hushed but urgent tone. Another flicked a lighter repeatedly, the small flame illuminating a face marked by a nasty scar. The third tapped a pistol against his thigh, impatience rolling off him like steam. John carefully angled his ear to catch fragments of the conversation, references to the farmer, the old man, and the land. He caught mention of a shipment scheduled in a few days, something that needed a secure corridor. The talk was peppered with curses and references to that little girl, making John's blood boil. Suddenly, Ray stiffened. He pointed to the right. The guard had reappeared, circling the house again. If he turned the corner, he might spot their silhouettes. Without a word, Leon slid around the corner like a shadow, intercepting the guard in a swift, silent takedown. A muffled grunt, a scuffle in the grass, and the guard went limp, unconscious. Leon dragged him out of sight, tying his hands with a plastic zip tie. Inside, the men continued their conversation, oblivious to their comrade's fate. John gestured for Ray to circle around for a better vantage. But as Ray stepped away, he inadvertently knocked a loose board on the porch, causing it to creak loudly. Instantly, the men inside went alert. The one with the phone barked an order in Spanish, and within seconds, the door flew open. Light spilled out onto the back porch, revealing John crouched near the wall. A burst of gunfire shattered the night. John dove rolling behind a rusted tractor implement. With splinters flew from the siding as bullets ripped through it. Ray and Leon took cover behind an old hay bale stack. The sheriff, alerted by the shots, came crackling over the radio. "What's going on?" John hissed into his earpiece, "Stay put. We're engaging." He fired 2 suppressed rounds toward the muzzle flashes, forcing the attackers to retreat behind the doorframe. The firefight escalated. More bullets raked the darkness. A window shattered and 1 cartel member emerged, only to be met by Leon's precise shot to the shoulder. The man collapsed, howling. Another tried to flee through the front of the house, but Ray circled wide and cornered him, firing a single shot that took him down. John advanced carefully, weaving around the side of the porch. Through the broken window, he could see the third man, the one who'd been on the phone, scrambling to grab a larger weapon. John took aim and fired. The man crumpled with a groan. Silence followed, pierced only by the guard's muffled whimpering and the crackle of broken glass underfoot. Breathing heavily, John signaled clear. Ray and Leon swept the house, confirming no one else was inside. They dragged the wounded men into one room, checking them for weapons. Soon, the sheriff arrived, wide-eyed at the carnage. "We had no choice," John said, his voice tight. "They opened fire first." Hastings exhaled, nodding. "I get it. I'll call an ambulance for these guys." John crouched beside the one who'd been on the phone. He recognized him as the man with the short-cropped mustache from Angela's description. "You threatened my family," John growled. "Who's your boss?" The wounded man spat blood, his eyes glassy from shock. You're dead, gringo. More will come." Ray stepped forward, pressing a boot gently on the man's wounded leg, eliciting a scream. "He asked you a question." "Nobody can help you now," John added quietly, his voice almost gentle. "Tell me who's in charge." The man sneered, his face contorted in pain. "Boss's name is Ortega. He'll kill you all." John glanced at Hastings. The sheriff scribbled the name in his notebook. "Ortega. He's the one who ordered your men to torch the farm stand." The wounded man only responded with a vile curse. Ray pressed harder with his foot and the man let out another wail. "See?" "Yes," he gasped. "Ortega runs this territory. We do what he says." John's jaw clenched. He nodded at Ray to let off. "Where's Ortega?" The man moaned, avoiding the question. But a second's silence earned him another jolt of pressure on the bullet wound, and he shrieked. He's planning to set up at an old warehouse near the border. He has men on their way here." "Why, you're dead. You and your family." John's eyes gleamed coldly. "Wrong answer," he murmured, rising to his feet. Hastings summoned medical help, though he knew it might be a long drive for the ambulance to get there. Meanwhile, Leon scouted the house, finding stacks of stolen firearms, crates of suspicious chemical drums, and documents in Spanish referencing shipments. It was a makeshift cartel safe house, exactly as they feared. The sheriff holstered his weapon and sighed. "This will blow wide open when the state police get here. I need to radio it in, say we had a tip about suspicious activity, got here, and found a firefight. I'll have to bend the truth a bit to keep you out of the official narrative." John placed a hand on the sheriff's shoulder. "Thank you." Hastings offered a tight nod. "I just hope we don't start a full-out war." John's gaze drifted toward the wounded men. "We already have. And we're going to finish it." Word spread quickly about the raid on the abandoned ranch, though the public only received fragments of the full story. Local whispers said the sheriff had discovered armed men linked to the same group that attacked the Mitchell farm. In some corners, rumors floated that John was involved. But the official statement was that the sheriff and his deputies engaged in a shootout during a routine check. In the days that followed, more black SUVs were spotted prowling the back roads. The cartel made no secret of their retaliation plans. One night, a neighbor's barn was set on fire. Another evening, threatening graffiti appeared on the post office wall, referencing Cuervos and blood for land. Fear tightened its grip on Sunnyside. Through it all, John quietly prepared. Grace and Angela remained under discreet protection. Ray and Leon stayed on the Mitchell farm, rotating watches and improving defenses. The sheriff did what he could, but he was stretched thin, trying to keep the peace among an increasingly anxious population. Then, late one afternoon, John received an anonymous text message. a picture of Grace's produce stand in flames. Accompanying it was a single line of text in Spanish, La familia muere pronto. The family dies soon. He showed it to Angela, who went pale. Grace, who was in the next room, felt the tension in the air. She approached quietly and saw the picture of her produce stand in flames, the same horrifying image she'd seen in person but now used as a threat. John knelt, wrapping an arm around Grace. "Listen to me, honey. These people, Los Cuervos, are just trying to scare us." She met his gaze, tears trembling at the corners of her eyes. "I am scared." "I know," he whispered, brushing hair from her face. "It's okay to be scared. I'm here now. I promise I won't let anything happen to you or Mom." Angela squeezed her daughter's shoulder, her own eyes swimming with concern. "John, we can't keep living like this. Are the police doing enough?" John looked away, fury smoldering in his expression. "No, they can't. This Ortega character is the key, and I intend to deal with him directly. If we cut off the head, the body dies." Angela hesitated, chewing her lip. "Are you sure that'll end it?" John rose slowly. "It's the only way I know." The next night, while the sheriff organized a small task force to investigate possible cartel hideouts, John decided to launch his own operation. He gleaned from the wounded men's statements and from some hastily translated cartel documents that Ortega was planning a major move soon. Maybe a big shipment or a wave of violence in Sunnyside to scare off holdouts. Ray, Leon, and John packed a pickup with gear and slipped away under the cover of darkness, heading for a rumored stash spot on the outskirts of a border town. Intelligence suggested Ortega might be directing operations from there. If so, John intended to confront him. The trip took hours over back roads and deserted stretches. Along the way, the men spoke little. Each was lost in his own thoughts, though they all shared the same readiness for a fight. They arrived near midnight, parking the truck a mile from the designated coordinates. They made the rest of the journey on foot, navigating by moonlight and the occasional flash of a suppressed flashlight. At last, they spotted a cluster of low buildings on a barren plain. Ramshackle structures that might once have been a small industrial complex, now repurposed for criminal activity. The hush of the desert night pressed in around them as they set up observation on a slight ridge, scanning with night vision optics. John counted 6 vehicles, including 3 black SUVs. Foot patrols circled the perimeter, at least 4 armed men. In the courtyard, a group of men loitered by a fire pit, chatting and occasionally shouting jokes in Spanish. There were easily a dozen or more people on site. Ray whistled low. "They've got numbers." Leon flexed his shoulders. "We've seen worse." John breathed steadily. "We're not here to wipe out an army. We're here to find Ortega. Confirm if he's here, gather intel, then we exfiltrate." They watched for nearly an hour, noting the patterns of guards. Finally, a sleek black SUV pulled up, from which stepped a tall man in a well-tailored suit, an incongruous sight in the dusty yard. He had slicked back hair, a silver ring on his left hand, and a commanding demeanor. The guards immediately straightened, as if in the presence of a superior. "That has to be Ortega," John whispered. Ray turned on the night vision camera, capturing footage. Ortega spoke with one of the men near the fire, occasionally gesturing angrily. Even from this distance, John sensed the man's authority and the menacing aura he exuded. They needed a better vantage, maybe get closer to record any mentions of the Mitchell farm or Sunnyside. John signaled for Ray and Leon to circle around. He would stay put with the camera. Ray and Leon melted into the darkness, inching closer along the perimeter fence. For a while, all was quiet. Then, John's earpiece crackled with Ray's whisper, "We've got eyes on Ortega. He's heading into a side building. Might be some offices. We're going to see if we can slip in." John's heart thudded. It was a risky move, but if they could gather direct evidence linking Ortega to the planned operations in Sunnyside, it would help them secure more official support, possibly from federal agents. Then they could dismantle Los Cuervos more systematically. Minutes ticked by, tension thickening. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from near the courtyard. Shouting, "More gunfire!" John's earpiece crackled. "We're made. Move, move, move." Cursing under his breath, John grabbed his rifle and sprinted down the ridge. Through the swirling dust and flickering firelight, he saw men running, muzzle flashes strobing the yard. Ray and Leon were pinned behind a stack of crates near the building entrance, exchanging shots with a half-dozen cartel soldiers. John raised his rifle, sighted a man firing at Ray, and squeezed the trigger. The assailant dropped. The muzzle flare lit the darkness for a split second. Another gunman turned, seeing the flash, and sprayed bullets in John's direction. John dove, rolling behind a rusted metal drum. The bullets pinged off the metal with sparks. Chaos descended. Guards yelled commands in Spanish, some jumping into SUVs to cut off escape routes. Ortega was nowhere to be seen, likely retreating into the building or slipping away. Ray and Leon fought fiercely, using the stacks of crates and barrels as cover. John flanked around, his ex-SEAL instincts kicking into overdrive. He saw one guard creeping along a shipping container, preparing to flank Ray and put him down with a well-placed shot. Another guard tried to toss a grenade, but Leon's quick reaction and pinpoint shot caused the man to crumple before he could throw. Amid the confusion, headlights blazed to life. An SUV roared out of the yard, churning up dust. John caught a glimpse of Ortega in the back seat, his face illuminated by interior lights, a flash of terror in his eyes. He was fleeing. John sprinted after the vehicle, firing at the tires, but the SUV fishtailed and powered through the gate. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted off the armored panels. Ortega escaped into the night. "John, we gotta go," Ray shouted. He and Leon were falling back, pressed by more gunfire from the remaining guards. More men poured out of the buildings, howling for blood. John made a split-second decision. Pursuit of Ortega would be suicidal without a vehicle and with so many hostiles still on site. They'd have to find him another time. Reluctantly, John turned and followed Ray and Leon, weaving between crates and ducking under a hail of bullets. They fired occasional shots to suppress the guards, though they were vastly outnumbered. They managed to exit the yard and slip back into the desert, the disorganized gunmen reluctant to chase too far without vehicles. Soon, the trio reached their truck, adrenaline pumping. They jumped in, Ray gunned the engine, and they sped away into the blackness, hearts pounding. John's mind whirled. Ortega was real, dangerous, and now alerted to their presence. But John had seen something in the man's eyes, a flicker of fear. He knew they were coming for him, and that fear could make him reckless or more brutal. The confrontation was inevitable. Back in Sunnyside, Angela waited anxiously for John's return. The next morning, when he finally walked through the door, dusty, exhausted, she threw her arms around him, relief warring with anger in her expression. "Are you okay?" "I was worried all night," she scolded, tears slipping from her eyes. He held her, pressing his forehead to hers. "I'm fine. We ran into trouble. Ortega got away." Grace, drawn by the commotion, appeared in the living room. She held a small crocheted doll, one John had brought her from a trip to Central America. She looked at her father, her brown eyes flicking down to the dust and scrapes on his arms. Did you stop them?" John crouched to her level. "Not yet," he admitted softly, "but we hurt them. They won't come here as confidently anymore." Grace's voice quivered. "But they might still come, right?" He nodded, unable to sugarcoat. "They might. That's why I need you and your mom to be extra careful." Over the following days, tension soared. More sightings of black SUVs, some said they saw convoys of them. Locals reported men in black jackets asking pointed questions about John Mitchell, referencing the farmer. Many families grew fearful, some even packing up to stay with relatives in bigger cities until the danger blew over. John found it increasingly difficult to sleep. He spent nights patrolling the farm's perimeter or reviewing any new intelligence. Ray and Leon took turns as well, both men unwavering in their commitment. The sheriff tried to coordinate with state and federal agencies, but bureaucracy dragged its feet. They needed a more decisive blow. One afternoon, a battered sedan pulled into Sunnyside. The driver was a local rancher named Howard Brooks, his face pale, tears in his eyes. He ran into the sheriff's office, stammering about how his teenage son had been kidnapped by men claiming to be Los Cuervos. They'd left a demand: turn over the ranch or never see the boy again. The sheriff's face darkened with rage. John heard the news from a frantic phone call. He felt a hot fury in his chest. This was the final straw. Targeting kids? This went beyond mere intimidation. He told Angela he had to leave to do something about the Brooks boy. But it's a trap, John, she pleaded. You know it. He kissed her forehead. I have to try. I can't stand by while they do this to innocent families. I won't let them terrorize Sunnyside anymore. Angela closed her eyes, fear creeping across her features, but she nodded. Just come back to us. That night, John, Ray, Leon, and Sheriff Hastings gathered with a few deputies. They reviewed the note left for the Brooks family, which gave instructions to drive to a remote location near the old railroad tracks at midnight. Hastings wanted to call in the state troopers for backup, but the note explicitly stated that if law enforcement was involved, they'd kill the boy. So they planned a covert approach. John insisted he and Ray and Leon would take point. The sheriff would remain at a distance to coordinate if things went bad. A hush settled over them as midnight approached, a sense of stepping into the lion's den once more, but this time with a child's life on the line. The old railroad siding lay 2 miles outside town, a desolate place of crumbling tracks and abandoned freight cars. Under the silver light of the moon, it looked like a ghostly battlefield. Howard Brooks arrived as instructed, alone, driving his dusty pickup. Parked in the open, he waited, hands shaking on the steering wheel. In the distance, concealed behind a row of rusted freight cars, John and his team crouched, scanning the scene through night vision goggles. At precisely midnight, 2 SUVs rolled up, headlights off. A half-dozen cartel thugs spilled out, dragging a teenage boy with his hands bound. John recognized him from around town, a lanky kid who always wore a ball cap. He was trembling, eyes wide. One of the men shoved him forward, pressing a pistol to the side of his head. Howard leapt out of his truck, arms raised. Please, don't hurt him. The man with the pistol, tattoos crawling up his neck, reminiscent of the group that attacked the Mitchell farm, sneered. You brought the deed? Everything we asked for? Howard lifted a stack of papers, voice cracking. Why yes. My ranch, it's yours. Just let my son go. John felt his stomach churn. He knew these men wouldn't likely keep their word. Once they had the papers, they could still dispose of father and son. He signaled Ray and Leon to move closer, hearts pounding. Sheriff Hastings watched from a vantage point behind some shrubs, radio in hand, ready to bring in reinforcements if gunfire erupted. Tattoos grabbed the papers, flipping through them. Another man yanked Howard's son upright, keeping the gun pressed to his skull. Boss wants the father to sign, too, he barked, handing a pen. Howard stumbled forward, tears staining his cheeks. He scrawled his signature in shaky lines. Now let him go, he begged, voice ragged. Tattoos exchanged a look with his comrades. They snickered. One raised the pistol from the boy's head only to aim it at Howard. Matalos, he spat, stepping back. Before the gunman could fire, a sharp crack of suppressed rifle fire sliced through the air. The pistol was wrenched from his grasp as a bullet tore through his forearm. He howled, dropping to the ground. In the same instant, John, Ray, and Leon sprang into action, unleashing a hail of precise shots that took down 2 more cartel men before they could even react. The rest of behind the SUVs, returning fire wildly. Bullets whined off metal freight cars. Howard scrambled to grab his son, pulling him into the truck's wheel well for partial cover. The firefight exploded into a furious exchange of muzzle flashes. John advanced methodically, weaving between rusted rail equipment, firing in controlled bursts. Ray and Leon flanked on either side, each picking off any cartel men who dared to show themselves. One SUV revved its engine, trying to speed off. Leon calmly aimed at the driver's side and fired, punching through the windshield. The SUV jerked sideways, crashing into a pile of cinder blocks. 2 men crawled out, only to be met by Ray's sidearm. Meanwhile, the man with the tattoos had crawled behind Howard's truck. In a desperate move, he grabbed Howard's son by the collar, yanking him upright as a human shield. Back off, he screamed. Or I blow his brains out. John froze, gun trained on the man's head. The angle was bad, too much risk to the teenager. Howard wailed, please, my son. The man backed away slowly, dragging the trembling kid. Throw your weapons down, he demanded. Ray and Leon exchanged a glance. They were good, but even they couldn't guarantee a headshot from this angle without endangering the hostage. John lowered his rifle slightly, keeping a measured breath. Let the boy go and you can walk out of here alive, he lied with practiced calm. Tattoos sneered, pressing the gun to the teen's temple. I'm not an idiot. You kill my friends, now you want mercy. Ray and Leon shifted positions subtly, trying to get a clear shot. The tension was a live wire. Howard sobbed, paralyzed with fear. John kept talking, voice low and steady. You have nowhere to go. The sheriff's just waiting for you to move. You can't get past us. The man's eyes darted around. He was cornered, blood trickling from his injured arm. He spat a curse in Spanish, fear mixing with rage on his face. This is your fault, he snarled. Your farm. Your stand. You can't scare Los Cuervos away. Slowly, the teen tried to wiggle free, tears streaming down his cheeks. Please, he whimpered. Suddenly, from the corner of John's eye, a blurred shape moved. Ray had found a vantage on a rusted ladder behind the man. With a single fluid motion, Ray dropped from above, driving a heavy boot into the man's wrist. The pistol skittered across the gravel. The teen lurched away free. In the same second, John lunged, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's face. He collapsed unconscious. A hush fell over the scene, broken only by Howard's sobs of relief and the teen's gasping breaths. John exhaled, heart hammering. Around them lay the sprawled forms of cartel men, some dead, some wounded. Sirens echoed in the distance as the sheriff and his deputies, responding to the gunfire, advanced to secure the area. Howard clutched his son, tears of gratitude streaming. Thank you. God, thank you. John gently helped them both stand. It's over now. You're safe. But he knew deep down it wasn't truly over. Ortega was still out there, orchestrating these attacks. Until Ortega was stopped, no one in Sunnyside would truly be safe. In the aftermath, the sheriff took statements, though he carefully omitted certain details about John's direct involvement. The Brooks family was safe, the son shaken but physically unharmed. A small victory in a larger war. Local news picked up the story of the kidnapping attempt, and speculation ran rampant. Some saw John as a hero, others worried his actions would provoke further retaliation. Fear still shadowed Sunnyside. Angela and Grace, staying in town for safety, watched the news with a mix of relief and anxiety. Grace trembled whenever she thought about the men who had burned her stand. She wanted to see them gone, but she also feared what might happen to her dad. She'd hear the phone ring at odd hours, see her mother's tense face, and lie awake at night imagining shootouts and SUVs in the darkness. John visited them the next morning, exhausted but alive. He held Grace in his arms, feeling the warmth of her small body against his chest. She didn't say much, but her eyes spoke volumes: love, fear, relief, and something else, unshakable faith in her father. Angela embraced him too, grateful yet terrified by the risk he was taking. That evening, as they sat in a borrowed living room, John quietly said, I have to finish this, Angie. She met his gaze, tears brimming. What do you mean? I have to find Ortega, he replied, voice trembling with controlled fury. He's the head of the snake. Unless he's stopped, he'll keep sending men here. Kidnappings, killings, it'll escalate. Angela bit her lip, nodding. She knew he was right, but it scared her to the core. Just come back in one piece. A cliff of uncertainty loomed before them. John prepared for a confrontation that would either secure Sunnyside's future or plunge it into deeper chaos. Ray and Leon had also recognized that they couldn't fight a never-ending stream of cartel gunmen. They needed to strike a decisive blow. The question was how to draw Ortega out. Desperate times called for desperate measures. With the sheriff's tacit approval, John devised a risky plan: lure Ortega to Sunnyside by making him think there was an opportunity to eliminate John and secure the farmland in one decisive strike. Using contacts from his old intelligence circles, John spread disinformation through back channels, suggesting that John was vulnerable, that local authorities were backing off, that the farmland corridor was still open if Ortega acted quickly. They wanted Ortega to believe if he dispatched a sizable force, he could take over once and for all. It was a gamble. If Ortega called the bluff, he might not show, and Sunnyside would remain under threat indefinitely. If he did show, it meant a potentially large-scale assault, risking many lives. But John prepared carefully. He worked with Sheriff Hastings and a few trusted deputies to set up hidden fortifications around the farm. Ray and Leon laid out fields of fire, vantage points, and fallback positions. The sheriff arranged to have some state troopers hidden nearby unofficially but ready to intervene if a large group arrived. Angela and Grace, under protest, were sent out of county lines to stay with extended family. Grace cried bitterly, not wanting to leave her father, but Angela insisted, "He's doing this for us. We'll be safer away from here." In the quiet that followed their departure, John felt the weight of finality. If Ortega came, if the rumors were correct, it would be a defining showdown. After that, one side or the other wouldn't be walking away. A week passed. The waiting was excruciating. Finally, on a muggy evening, word came from one of the sheriff's informants. A convoy of SUVs had been spotted heading towards Sunnyside. Possibly a dozen vehicles, maybe more. John, Ray, Leon, and the sheriff's deputies braced themselves. The troopers, hidden in strategic positions on the far side of the Mitchell farm, waited in silence. The orchard rustled in the faint breeze, the nighttime hum of insects replaced by the throbbing tension of an impending battle. At around midnight, headlights appeared at the edge of the farm. The line of SUVs halted, engines idling. John, observing from an upstairs window with Ray, counted at least 10 vehicles. Men poured out armed to the teeth, forming up in a semicircle near the driveway. One figure emerged from the center SUV, flanked by heavily armed bodyguards. Ortega. John's pulse hammered. He recognized the man's posture from the previous glimpse in the desert. Despite the darkness, John sensed Ortega's cold arrogance. Here he was, personally overseeing the takeover. Over a loudspeaker, Ortega's voice crackled in heavily accented English. "John Mitchell, come out now. No more games. This is my land." John gave a nod to Leon, who was stationed in a hidden position, ready to respond. He stepped outside onto the porch, rifle slung. The men near Ortega raised their guns. "Ortega," John called. "This isn't your land, and it never will be. Walk away or you'll regret it." The cartel boss laughed harshly. "You think you can scare me with your little militia? I have an army. You are alone." John kept his stance firm. "I'm never alone." Then he raised a handheld radio to his lips. "Execute." A sudden commotion erupted on the cartel's right flank. 2 state trooper cars roared to life, headlights blasting, sirens wailing. Ray, positioned on a rooftop behind the orchard, opened with well-aimed shots at the trailing vehicles, disabling tires. Leon, hidden behind a stand of hay bales, unleashed controlled bursts at the bodyguards. Chaos seized the yard. Ortega's men scattered, returning fire in every direction. The orchard glowed with muzzle flashes. Engines revved as some drivers attempted to back out, but the troopers moved in to block their escape. John dove behind a thick wooden planter on the porch, returning fire with deadly accuracy. One by one, cartel men dropped. The smell of gunpowder and the roar of gunfire filled the night air. Bullets whistled past John's cover, thudding into the farmhouse walls. Ortega, pinned down behind his SUV, cursed loudly in Spanish. Several of his men already lay wounded or dead. The orchestrated ambush was devastating his ranks. But he wasn't done. One of the SUVs roared forward, headlights blazing, swerving toward the porch as if to run John down. At the last second, John rolled aside, firing at the vehicle's windshield. The driver slumped, causing the SUV to veer off, crashing into the front porch steps. A fiery explosion erupted moments later as the engine caught flame. In the flickering light, Ortega spotted a gap in the orchard. He barked an order to the few men still on their feet, and they charged that way. Ray, seeing the movement, shouted a warning over the radio. Leon hurried to intercept, but Ortega tossed a grenade that detonated behind the hay bales, forcing Leon to dive aside. Shrapnel peppered the area. John scrambled to his feet, ignoring the ringing in his ears, and sprinted after Ortega into the orchard. The leaves rustled overhead, lit by muzzle flashes and the faint glow of the burning SUV. Gunshots sounded behind him as the sheriff's deputies traded fire with the remaining cartel goons. Branches slapped at John's face as he tore through rows of peach trees. In the distance, he could see Ortega and 2 bodyguards hustling. He fired, dropping one guard with a precise shot to the torso. The second swung around, returning fire wildly. John ducked behind a tree trunk. The bark splintered under a barrage of bullets. When the shooting paused, John darted out and fired twice, taking down the second guard. Ortega spun, leveling a pistol at John. Their eyes locked in the half-light. A moment of recognition. This was the man who had terrorized his family, threatened Grace. They fired simultaneously. John felt a searing pain in his left arm, staggering. Ortega grunted as a bullet tore through his side. He collapsed against a tree, leaving a smear of blood on the bark. John advanced, ignoring the pain. His rifle was empty, so he tossed it aside, drawing his sidearm. Ortega, breathing ragged, aimed again, but his hand shook. They stood just yards apart, each wounded. The orchard was eerily quiet now, gunfire distant behind them. You could have walked away," Ortega rasped, blood bubbling on his lips. John's voice was cold. "You attacked my family. You threatened my daughter." Ortega sneered through his pain. "You think this ends with me? Los Cuervos is bigger than one man. Maybe, but at least Sunnyside will be free of you." A flicker of fury crossed Ortega's face. He tried to raise his pistol, but John's shot rang out first. Ortega's eyes widened in shock. Then he slid down the trunk, lifeless. John swayed, exhaustion and pain threatening to overwhelm him. He sagged against a tree, pressing a hand to the bullet graze on his arm. The orchard around him glimmered with the residue of gun smoke. Sirens grew closer, backup, or maybe just the sheriff's men combing the area. It was over. Ortega was dead. But for John, the memory of Grace's terrified face and Angela's tears still burned. He closed his eyes, relief and sorrow mingling in his heart. No matter how many times he'd had to do this in faraway lands, it never got easier. The days following the orchard battle were a whirlwind. The state troopers and sheriff's department mopped up the remaining cartel operatives. Some fled the area, others were arrested. The confrontation at the Mitchell farm made headlines across Texas. Accounts of a major cartel assault thwarted by a heroic stand. Much of John's role was left out of official statements, due to the delicate legality of it all, but word of mouth in Sunnyside painted him as a legend. Ray and Leon stayed a few days to help John recover. He had a bandaged arm, but the wound was not life-threatening. The orchard bore scars of bullet holes and torn ground, but it still stood. The once quiet farmland had seen war, and yet it survived. Eventually, life began to regain its shape. The threat of Los Cuervos no longer loomed. Angela and Grace returned home, weeping with relief to see John alive. The house had some repairs to undergo, the orchard a bit of cleanup, but the family was together again. And that was all that mattered. One afternoon, Grace walked out to the roadside with her father. She held the half-burned sign reading "Fresh" to her chest. The old produce stand was gone. Just a patch of scorched earth remained. She looked up at John. "Dad, can we rebuild it?" He rested a hand on her shoulder, gazing over the land. "We will. Maybe bigger, better than before." A small smile touched his lips. "You and I can build it together." A new wave of tears shimmered in Grace's eyes, but they were tears of hope, not fear. "Okay," she whispered. They began gathering wood and materials. It would take time to build something lasting, a symbol of renewal. But Grace and John worked side by side, occasionally joined by Angela, constructing a fresh farm stand with sturdy posts, a new roof, and a bigger table for produce. Neighbors pitched in, too, grateful for the Mitchell family's stand against tyranny. When the stand was finally done, it was a bright, cheery structure with a fresh coat of paint. Grace proudly arranged baskets of vegetables and fruits. People from all across the county came to buy produce, many just wanting to support the brave little girl who refused to be bullied off her land. One day, a battered pickup truck rattled up, and out stepped the Brooks family, the father and teenage son who had been kidnapped. The boy shyly offered Grace a small handmade card that read, "Thank you." Grace smiled, handing him a basket of peaches in return. No charge. A shared look of understanding passed between them. Both had faced terror, both were still standing. Sunlight poured across the Mitchell farm like warm honey, illuminating rows of corn and neat sections of vegetables that thrived under Angela's green thumb. Chickens pecked in the yard, oblivious to the violence that once stained this land. At the new produce stand, Grace sold strawberries and tomatoes to neighbors, her brown eyes shining with the knowledge that she had survived something terrible. A small scar on one of the posts reminded them of the night the cartel had tried to force them out. But that scar also symbolized resilience. John Mitchell, still sometimes referred to in hushed tones as the deadliest farmer in Sunnyside, occasionally patted the side of the produce stand with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He knew he had taken lives in defense of his family and home. Part of him wished it never had to happen, but he also felt relief that those evil men couldn't threaten Grace or Angela anymore. He hadn't single-handedly crushed Los Cuervos as a whole. Such cartels often reconstituted elsewhere like a hydra. But at least in this corner of Texas, peace had returned. The battered farmland corridor they had hoped to turn into a smuggling route was now under vigilant watch by law enforcement. Word spread that messing with Sunnyside was bad business. In quiet moments, John would stand near the orchard at dusk, remembering the gunfight among the peach trees. A faint ache in his arm reminded him of how close it had been. He'd watch the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in oranges and reds, a reminder that even the darkest nights ended in light. Grace continued to greet customers each day, proudly announcing her fresh picks. Sometimes, local kids set up their own stands nearby, emboldened by her determination. Sunnyside thrived, the community strengthened by the adversity they'd faced. When asked how she'd overcome such danger, Grace would merely shrug and say, "We didn't run. We stood our ground." She was only 8, but she carried a wisdom beyond her years. As for the Mitchell family, they rarely spoke in detail about that harrowing time. They were content to move forward, to plant seeds of hope in the fertile soil of Sunnyside. Every so often, John would receive a discreet call for help from other corners of the world, reminders of the life he once led, the missions he'd undertaken. But for now, he stayed home, teaching Grace how to care for the orchard and helping Angela manage the farm. He'd earned a season of peace. And so, if you ever travel the back roads near Sunnyside, Texas, you might come across a thriving vegetable stand run by a bright-eyed girl with a heart full of courage. You wouldn't guess that, not so long ago, a vicious cartel tried to snuff out her family's dreams. But if you look closely, you'll see the strong fences around the farm, and you might notice the watchful gaze of a tall, silent man nearby. That's John Mitchell, the Navy SEAL who put down roots in Texas soil, only to rise in fierce defense of everything he held dear. It is said the orchard yields the sweetest peaches in the region, the kind that remind you of resilience, love, and a quiet, unwavering resolve. In every juicy bite, you taste the soil that was defended by a father's unbreakable spirit and a daughter's unwavering hope. And so the Mitchell farm stands, a testament that even in the face of unspeakable threats, the courage of a family united can shine like the brightest star in the Texan night sky.